We are discussing it right now. Joining us is Ilya Butenko, a political commentator. Ilya, good morning.
Good morning.
Ilya, I wanted to ask you. Look, if we are talking about the tunnels that lead from Belarus, say, into Latvia, it's clear what they are used for. Tell me, how obvious is the, trail of the Belarusian and Russian authorities in organizing these waves, of migrants? Is it not all that clear-cut, or can we, in principle, call things by their proper names and understand who is behind this?
We can call things by their proper names, because digging tunnels under the border is quite a task that is difficult to do without the patronage of the authorities. That is, obviously, these migrants who are crossing the border in this way are being helped by Russians and Belarusians, and they are pursuing the goal of destabilizing the countries they border in this way, in order to somehow force them to change their policy towards Russia itself and Belarus itself, respectively. We also had cases of illegal immigration in previous years. That was actually the migrant crisis in 2021, when quite a lot of migrants were arriving through Belarusian territory into Poland and Lithuania. Back then, it ended with border security functions also being strengthened. That is, a fence was built, and in fact, even before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, a more reinforced regime of border crossing control and overall border security was established. And it was also all viewed as the Lukashenko regime, like the Putin regime, conducting such a policy. If these countries take the most critical positions regarding Minsk and Moscow, then, accordingly, they need to be shown that these countries cannot handle the risks. That is, they were creating such risks to demonstrate the incompetence of these states' governments and, accordingly, to push society either to change its opinion regarding Russia and Belarus or to change the government. As we can see, they didn't really succeed in that. That is, just as Poland and the Baltic countries held a critical position regarding the Kremlin and Lukashenko, they continue to hold it. But this is a case where they still continue to destabilize in order to somehow strengthen the positions of populists, Eurosceptics, and the far right who are starting to criticize the European Union for its unified migration policy, which, in their view, is overly liberal. Both the Kremlin and Minsk also continue to effectively make plans regarding how they can achieve more global changes in the foreign policy of these countries in this way.
Let's look at the source. I understand correctly, don't I, that Belarus has a very, so to speak, very strategic goal and an important goal for itself here, the destabilization of the situation directly in Latvia. But I understand correctly that this comes from the Belarusian authorities themselves?
Comes from two key sources. There is the Lukashenko factor and there is the Kremlin factor. To a certain extent, these two sides are in the same boat. There is some point of divergence between them. For example, regarding the fact that in 2022, Belarus limited its support for Russia in the war against Ukraine to only providing territory, rather than the participation of its own armed forces. Although there is also a trend where quite a few Belarusian mercenaries are joining the occupying forces. But nevertheless, in the context of relations with Eastern Europe, with Poland, with Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, these countries act in principle as one. And Belarus, in this case, acts as a certain counteragent of Russian influence, because Russia, although currently fully focused on the war in Ukraine, also has a tendency to show aggression towards its other Western neighbors. These are, again, the Baltic countries. This is Poland, that is, those countries that hold the most pro-Ukrainian position in the European Union. And since the Russian armed forces are currently firmly bogged down in the war against Ukraine, they are limited to certain hybrid threats. That is, they are effectively pursuing a policy of splitting society, inciting panic, and strengthening the influence of populists who are unable to make adequate decisions to counter Russian influence. And in this way, they are currently effectively pursuing a policy of clearing the rear, in which these countries, in their view, will have to abandon their support for Ukraine in order to fight the threats that Russia is creating for them with the help of Belarus. And Lukashenko is playing along with them on this issue, because he has no other allies in this region right now. And, accordingly, it is also advantageous for him to have Belarus somehow distanced from Russia in this case, to demonstrate to the West his necessity as a player who can influence migration flows, although his capabilities are very limited. And in principle, Belarusian policy after 2020 has been operating within a rather narrow corridor. And on one hand, they face the risk of being drawn into the war, and this would lead to them being unable to restore diplomatic relations or trade relations with the Western world after the war ends. On the other hand, they also cannot challenge Russia right now because after 2020, Russia effectively took control over Belarusian politics and the Belarusian economy, which was already strong even before that. Right now, they are effectively forcing them to go ahead of them, that is, effectively to be that first player who violates the borders of Europe, violates the boundaries of what is permissible in order to pave the way for what Russia itself will do after them, which is dirtier politics. We saw the same thing regarding Russian aggression against Ukraine. Let's recall that before 2022, and even before 2014, Russia was conducting a destabilizing policy towards Ukraine. And accordingly, before starting a full-scale military aggression, there is always a situation where the aggressor clears their positions to have the enemy country. Previously, it was Ukraine, and now it is Ukraine. In the future, this could be the countries of Eastern Europe, that is, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland, in order to have these countries weakened so that they cannot provide an adequate response. How this will develop in the future is difficult to say right now, but the trend is that Europe understands the risks that Russia is effectively sanctioning such destructive policy. In other words, issues of migration crises are being linked to what is currently happening regarding Russian aggression against Ukraine and the Russian threat in Eastern Europe. And accordingly, ways to counter this are also being sought.
Ilya, tell me, can we consider, let's say, the preparation of things related to various migration crises, yes, of different types, of different intensity, as, one of the elements of such further, yes, path of escalation that the Kremlin will follow one way or another, clearly using both aid and Belarus as a certain platform? It works comprehensively. And here's a crisis for you, and then perhaps we will move on to more active hybrid operations against you. Well, meaning EU countries and NATO countries.
Yes, of course, that is exactly what the Kremlin strategy is designed for. We can even recall 2015, when Russia's aggression against Ukraine had already begun, and in parallel, Russia launched an operation in Syria. That is, there was a certain influx of refugees. This was also happening while the ISIS group was strengthening in Iraq and Syria. And against this backdrop, support for the far right began to grow in Europe. That is, at that same time, the Alternative for Germany party began to gain strength. At that same time, the positions of Marine Le Pen's party in France also strengthened. That is, these political forces, they emerged from such a marginal circle. And such political forces are, as a rule, financed and in principle supported by Russia with its organizational resources because they are considered, firstly, more compliant and secondly, less capable of organizing any kind of systemic policy of opposition. That is, even back then, 11 years ago, there was a situation where Russia was effectively using these kinds of migration crisis scenarios to pave the way to power for its loyalists, who were then supposed to act as a factor in weakening Europe and making it less resilient in the face of actual Russian military pressure. And since that method worked back then, the Kremlin adopted it and has continued to use it ever since. Again, we can recall that the positions of right-wing forces in Eastern Europe are already quite strong as it is. We know the situation in Poland, where there is effectively a government crisis between the right-wing government and the far-right president, and accordingly, Russia plays on this in such a way as to create a split to radicalize the situation, where first there is simply a radicalization of opponents, then their break with each other, and then the transition of some of these opponents to terms that are more compromising for the Kremlin, in which they can further strengthen their influence, further strengthen the influence of their loyalists. And accordingly, in the longer term, according to the Kremlin's calculations, this contributes to them being able to exert more serious hybrid and ultimately forceful influence on their opponents.
Ilya, thank you for joining us. Political commentator Ilya Butenko was with us.